So my name is Sam McClelland and I'm the director of True Arrow Events. And a couple of years ago, I was a primary school music teacher. Now, I taught overseas for a number of years and I came back to Australia and I got a job in a local primary school. And it was a part-time job, so I had a lot of spare time. So I started researching psychology to become a better teacher. And I came across Jordan Peterson. And then from coming across Jordan Peterson, I came across many people, such as Professor Stephen Hicks. And so I accumulated a lot of knowledge very quickly. Now, at my school, I had some very interesting discussions in the staff room with all my newfound knowledge. And one of those discussions came about during a staff meeting where there was a program that was going to be introduced to these primary school students, and it was very politically indoctrinating. So I raised my concern during the meeting, and for doing so, I was labelled a number of things. What followed was complaints against me, and then I started receiving lots of letters, 8-page letters full of legal jargon. I was summoned to meetings in front of panels, legal people, all for saying what I had said in this meeting. And my only concern that I really raised was that I wanted to make sure that these students didn't develop a sense of white guilt, basically, for this program, which Jacinta Price would have had many problems with. So I had to make a difficult decision, and that was to leave my beloved profession, which was teaching. And so I was very lost and looking for something to do in the world. So a few months later, I found myself organising a tour for Dr. Jordan Peterson, which was back in 2018. And that was a very interesting tour, and thus began True Arrow Events. So 2 years later, I'm now very happy to be introducing someone who I think is an exceptional philosopher and perhaps will go down as one of the best in the 21st century. And that is Professor Stephen Hicks. He is Professor of Philosophy at Rockford, Illinois, and has come all the way from the USA to speak to us Australians. He is author of 5 books, including Explaining Postmodernism and Liberalism Pro and Con, which is released just this week and is available in the foyer. And it's very interesting how philosophy has shaped the last 200 years and continues to do so as has mutated over time. So I'm very pleased to introduce a series of events that will explore postmodernism and the meanings of life and what comes after postmodernism. So his books are translated into 20 languages, thereabouts, by now. He's lectured all around the world. So please welcome Professor Stephen Hicks.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Sam. I'm midstream on my new book, which is trying to be positive, because I've done some dark work on postmodernism, Nietzsche, the Nazis, and others. And my question is going to be, given that we are in a postmodern moment, intellectually and culturally, whatever that means, we'll say more about that. But supposing we get back to real philosophy, real questions, and we're able to debate them in the full-throated, full-hearted way that a liberal society should be able to do so, what are the questions and issues that we as thoughtful, passionate human beings will need to engage with? The working title of the book is The Meanings of Life, plural, and the subtitle is After Postmodernism. So I thought tonight I would start with some excerpts from the manuscript as it's developing, and then backfill into the problem that we are grappling with right now, which is, of course, we talk about free speech assault and hate speech and all sorts of limitations politically correctly upon what we are able to say. And we all know the subtext of all of the things that we are not allowed to talk about, opinions we are not allowed to express. Supposing we lift the lids off and get back to the full debate, what will that sound like? So, why are we here? That's the question we all ask. And one answer is to say it's pretty basic. We are here because we are at the tail end of a long line of survivors. It's about survival. And every generation, going back however many generations you want to count, had individual organisms who were successful at two things: eating enough and getting someone to have sex with them. So we are survivors. And what that has meant is that we have bred into us evolutionarily powerful instincts. We are at the top of the food chain, so we have powerful aggressive instincts for killing and eating things. Of course, we've civilized to some extent, but then also for having sex to make sure that we pass on our genes. So it's eat, sex, raise the kids, and then subside as the next generation rises. Where I went to graduate school, I came from Canada originally, was in a warmer part of the United States, and my first spring there, the cicadas came out. I had never experienced cicadas before. These were the 7-year cicadas. Apparently what they do is they're underground, just in a larval state, larva, vegetating basically for 7 years. The spring of the 7th year, the rains come, the ground softens, they come out of their larval state, they crawl up to the surface, they sprout their wings, they climb up into, or fly rather now, up into the trees, and then they start that intensely irritating, nonstop buzzing. Right? That's the thing that woke me up that first morning. And they don't stop until the male cicadas and the female cicadas are, I'm over here, I'm over here. They find each other, they have sex, the male dies. That's it. The female lives long enough to get back down to the ground, burrow underground, lay the next generation of eggs, she dies. And then nothing happens for 7 more years, the cycle happens again. So, eat, sleep, sex, die. 7 years, over and over again. Now, suppose you're a philosopher for cicadas. What's it all about? Why are we here? What are we doing? And what's the difference between us and the cicadas? They have a 7-year life cycle. You know, ours is world average 77, so it's 11 times or 10 times as much. But we're asleep for 25, 26 years of that. We eat. We put on the ball and chain at work. We have sex. And then we subside. Now, there must be something more, is a standard response to that. And maybe the way to get at it is to ask, well, where did it all come from? Yes, it's here, but where did it all come from? How do we explain the fact that there is a world in which all of these things happen, and that it's structured and ordered the way it is? So there must be a God or gods, some sort of beings that brought the universe into existence and gave it order and form. And even if we, from our semi-cicada-like perspective, haven't tapped into what's going on in the bigger picture, it makes sense that there is a bigger picture. But then our response says, look, now we're talking about God or the gods, and how long have we been arguing about whether or not there really is a God or a god's. Millennia, all of the same arguments get trotted out on both sides, back and forth. So the point is, nobody really knows that there is a God. Maybe there's a kind of wishful thinking. So really, bottom line is, it's all up for grab. Believe in God, fine, but don't believe in God, also fine. If we choose not to believe in a God, then where are we going to get good and bad, or this idea that some things are meaningful and some things are meaningless from? What does evil even mean? It seems that if God were real, he would have made it a lot clearer at some point along the many thousands of years human beings have been around. Right? I mean, he has access to social media, he can keep us updated, and so on. Okay. Tighter? Good. Instead, from this perspective, we're supposed to be relying on the alleged insights of some semi-literate guys who were wandering around in the desert about 3,000 years ago. What did they know about science? Weren't they probably status-seeking, just like so many of our own generation, perhaps engaged in wishful thinking, just like so many of our own generation? On what basis can we construct a reasonable meaning of life going in that direction? So the more reasonable thing is to say, there are no gods, we're on our own in this world, and each of us is on our own. So do what you like. Don't take orders from voices in the sky. Sound your own voice. But that sounds like a blank check if we start saying to people, do what you want. Find your inner voice, your inner instincts, your inner desires, and legislate your life for yourself instead of relying on externally imposed legislation. Well, we know there's a lot of weird people out there in the world. And what comes out of their voices is rather strange and dark, and if they act on the basis of that, they start doing some pretty nasty, sadistic, destructive things. So we can't just tell people, do whatever you want, rely on your own voice. Maybe what we should do then is to say it's the voice of most people. Socialize it. Yes, there are some weirdos out there around the fringes, but it's the community voice or the voice of the majority that we could rely upon, and that is where we can get our standards and our understanding of what life is about. We have traditions that have evolved over the course of many millennia, and the traditions that have stuck with us have served us well. So we are born into the world, we don't get a divine revelation, but we have our culture to rely upon. That's where we will find meaning. But that also doesn't seem to help very much. The reply comes because look at all the weird cultures out there in the world. And even into our own time, the vast numbers of little girls subjected to clitoridectomies every week, child marriages that go on all around the world in little pockets, sometimes overtly, sometimes less overtly, the wanton cruelty, the fact that there is still slavery, by and large, tolerated if you come from a very poor village in a remote mountain and you have too many daughters, it's fine. When the trader comes around to sell one of your pretty daughters into slavery, after all, she will have a nicer life in the city than out in the mountains, and she can send some money back to the family. All of this goes on, underscored by centuries of tradition. So, now we're back to then saying, we can't rely on individuals, we can't rely on societies, we do need one authoritative voice. We need a God. We just know there are some things that are sick, unhealthy, wrong, wanton cruelty, mass murder, indiscriminate killing, and so forth. And if we can't find the fact, in all of us, the fact that some people don't find a problem with it, or even in some societies, where do we get that knowledge from? There must be an absolutely authoritative source to underwrite our conviction that some things are absolutely wrong. But even if we suppose there's a God, that doesn't really answer our question, unless you want to just take it as an act of faith, because then we'd ask, well, where did God get the standard from if he's going to be the legislator of morality? And here we have a choice. We could say, well, either God is smart and he discovered out there in the world, in reality, what was actually moral, and he's just telling us what he has independently discovered in the world. But in that case, we should be able to figure it out for ourselves. If it's out there in the world, we can find that moral standard. On the other hand, if we say, no, he just made it up himself, he didn't find it out in the world, well, then how do we know that whatever he made up is true, decent? Maybe it's an evil, malevolent God who's making stuff up. And if we don't have an independent way of verifying the validity of this divine being, we're not in a better position anyway. So maybe the problem is that, yes, we can conceive of ideal moral standards, certain things that are just plain wrong, and we all kind of know that, and when we're speaking to each other, of course, we'll agree that we're into fairness and honesty and integrity and justice, and all of those are good things, whether or not we believe in a God to underwrite them. But at the same time, we know that those ideals are very little practiced in reality, don't we? The response will be. We all engage in little lies and little hypocrisies and little cheats, and we're the good people. There's lots and lots of people who engage in those things on a large-scale basis, and they get away with it. So the realistic position really is a kind of cynical position. The fact is, morality is just a set of ideals that some of us pay lip service to, but reality is not about achieving the good, the moral, and the decent. So cynicism. We didn't make the world, most people say. I just do what I have to get by in the world that other people have made. But cynicism eats at your soul. So maybe to stop that inner torment and inner turmoil, we need to be more stoical. Take a lesson from the great ancients who said, look, if you want to find meaning and significance in life, you have to be very clear about what's under your control and what you cannot control. Cynicism comes from expecting the world and other people to live up to your high standards. And of course, the world isn't going to live up to your high standards, and other people aren't going to live up to your high standards. So you're just setting yourself up for disappointment, and cynicism is a result of that. So what you have to recognize is you can't control the world, and that's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to be clear about what is under your control, and what is under your control are your thoughts, your feelings, your reaction to the world. Take charge of that. Don't make your soul and your mind hostage to the actions of other people. Control your own mind. Strive to find your own sense of integrity and inner peace, and let the world go the way it will go. That's a meaningful life. But isn't that cowardice? A reply comes. You're going to give up on other people. You're going to give up on the whole world. You're going to retreat to your own little safety zone and feel comfortable there. Doesn't a meaningful life come from commitment to the world, sometimes as ugly as the world is, to all of the risks and all of the failures? You have to put yourself out there. And maybe there is no God or one right answer or a societal impulse that should apply to everyone. The fact is that what we all need to do to feel alive is an authentic commitment to something. Now, we're all different, so what that something is going to be will be highly variable, and no one can tell you what that is. And so here we have the long-standing legacies of various sorts of fantasies about power, but these fantasies are tapping into something important. Aladdin's magic lamp and you rub it and the genie comes out and grants you 3 wishes, whatever you want. Well, what is that? That's actually not easy to figure out. Or the Greek myth of Gyges, who finds a magic ring that when he puts it on, it's got a stone on it, and he turns the stone inwards, he becomes invisible. So then he can do basically whatever he wants as an invisible man. But what do we really want? Or another variation of this is the gods summon you to their banquet table. You have been favored for some reason, and they say, we grant you 1 wish. What is your heart's desire? Well, what do you choose? Riches, beauty, again, to be young with your whole life ahead of you. Sex with the prettiest woman or the handsomest man in the world as often as you want. To be able to read other people's minds. Artistic brilliance. To have a sunny disposition and enjoy every day that you are alive. To be a mathematical genius who can solve the mysteries of the universe. Power. To make other people do whatever you want. What are actually the top values that energize us? But of course, that power is a fantasy. And maybe again, we have to get a little darker, because the fact is that the vast majority of people in our advanced civilization have enormous amounts of power at their fingertips. The devices for communication and contact that we have, astounding to the ancients. And we find out what most people want when we see what they do with all of the power that's available to them. I just go to the shopping mall. I don't know if you've done this exercise, good philosophical experiment, and just watch the people go by. Those people can do anything they want with their lives, and they live in an extraordinarily rich society, but just look at them. Are any of them inspired? Are any of them doing anything significant with their lives? Maybe 1 or 2. Yeah, they go to the mall, they binge watch TV, they hang out in internet chat rooms, irritate each other, watch porn, and that's their sex life. Speaking of the internet, right, cat pictures, all the insults and touchiness, semi-literate arguing, power at their fingertips, and it's not a pretty picture. But this maybe should not be a numbers game. We just shouldn't say, well, whatever most people want. Maybe the right way to think about this issue is in terms of more fundamental human capacities and what is possible with them. Yes, we have instincts and desires and drives, and we have basic needs that we can satisfy at the mall and on the internet and so forth. And sometimes, yes, we do just want to binge watch in front of the television set. But even if only a minority of human beings are taking the capacities that they have and doing something significant with us, that minority is significant, and they point out what is fundamentally true and important about the human condition. So I used to have a dog, for example. He was part Great Dane, had very long legs, and so he could see anything over the kitchen counter, which meant whenever he was hungry for a while when I first got him, he would just eat anything that he wanted off the kitchen counter. So he learned that he was not allowed, though, to eat things off the kitchen counter. And he was a good dog, so he followed along that. But I used to make a sandwich for myself at lunch, and I remember one time making the sandwich, Hamlet, my dog, drooling. I looked at him, he looked at me. I said, "No, Hamlet, my sandwich." And he understood. The doorbell rang. Some delivery or something was other, right? Another significant moment of eye contact. And I said, "No." And I left the room. I was gone for about 3 minutes. There was a package being delivered, and I came back. the sandwich was gone. Big surprise, yes? And I said, "Bad Hamlet," right? And he crouched, right? So he knew that he did something wrong, but there's a difference. He's just a dog. And at some point we say, look, we don't expect that much responsibility from a dog. So I used to tease my brother because he's a little younger than I and has a pretty healthy attitude as well. So imagine instead it wasn't Hamlet the dog, it's my brother. He's visiting, and I'm making a sandwich, and my brother is looking at my sandwich with that look in his eye. I say, "My sandwich." The doorbell rings. I say, "No." And I go to the door, and I come back in 3 minutes, and the sandwich is, it had better be there. Because he's a human. He has the same urges, the same desires, the same understanding, my sandwich and so forth, but he's able to control himself the way an animal doesn't. So the fact that lots of people might just give into their basic urges on a regular basis, like Hamlet the dog, and not ascend, that doesn't teach us about what is possible to humans and what's important to humans. My brother and all of the rest of us, we can control ourselves, our appetites, our emotions. We can think in principles, and we can hold those principles in mind and act on those principles. That's the essence of what human beings are. And to the extent that we have done that, and we've started to do that spectacularly successfully in the modern world, this line of argument runs, we have made progress, astounding progress. The human conceptual faculty and its exercise is the most amazing story of the last millennium. And one element of this, of course, is just science. Look at all of the stuff we had figured out from science. It's not easy. It's been a huge amount of work among thousands of people, but we have made progress. And those indicators are pretty obvious. Life expectancy for most of human history was in the 20s. Then starting about 15,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution and the metallurgical revolution, it went up into the 30s. And then for basically 15 to 17,000 years, it was in the 30s. At the time of the American Revolution, at the time Australia was being settled, life expectancy, even in the developed countries, was still in the 30s. And that's less than 2 centuries ago. Over the course of a century and a half, more than a doubling of life expectancy. Because we're smart. The fact that most people don't choose to use their intelligence that much or very consistently, that's not the point. It's not a numbers game. It's something about a principle, fact about the human condition. That's what we should be doing, exercising our rationality to figure out the way the world works to make life better. It used to be 200 years ago that about 50% of all infants died in the first 3 years, which is partly why we had large families. Now it's 1 in 1,000 infant mortality, and that's in the poorer parts of the world. We are living longer, and we are living happier. Yes, happiness comes from science. Because you know what? Happiness is not dying at age 35, your body worn out. Happiness is being able to see your children grow up and see your grandchildren. You know what happiness is? Happiness is not having half of your children die before age 3. That's happiness. You see the statistics, and some people say the statistics are just abstract, that's just numbers. No, those statistics, you're looking at happiness. You see those statistics. We get more life, and we get better life. All right, science, man, there's always a flip side to every story, isn't there? You know what else science tells us? The vastness of the universe and how insignificant our expanded lifespan is. So most humans used to live 35 years and then they died. and they were dead forever. Now we live to 80, and then we die, but we're still dead forever. In the context of forever, what's the difference between 80 and 35? That's a pretty small number. Entropy, everything, all energy systems dissipate into nothingness eventually. So yeah, we can fly through our airplanes, and another amazing thing that every single one of us in the room, I bet, has flown in a tin can miles above the earth. How awesome that is. And all of the 99.9% of all of the humans who have ever existed never had that experience. So we can have that experience, blasting rock and roll music through our devices and having a good old time for a few years. And then what happens? Well, it ends. And we know that it's going to end. So yes, we are smart, we are intelligent, but that also brings with us a curse. The curse of knowing that we're going to die. So we can lie in the sun on a nice beach and enjoy it. And a dog can be lying on the beach in the sun and enjoying it. But the dog doesn't know it's going to die, that it's going to end, and we do. And that has to gnaw away at us the more we think about life and the condition. Sooner than I would like to think, I'm going to be in a box in the ground somewhere. Or maybe I'll be burned up and become ashes. Or I'll be given a sky burial. The birds will come and pick at my flesh until my skeleton is bare bones bleaching in the sun. What might be my favorite? Before I went back to graduate school, I worked for some years in construction. My crew head was a guy who was an explosive expert who worked all over the world, basically blowing things up. Sounds like a great job, but for building dams and bridges and so on. And he'd worked on a huge dam in the Congo and become friends with the guy who was the foreman, a giant black man, as he described him, who was the foreman of the Congolese team of laborers. And they got to be very close. And when the project was over and they were going their separate ways, the giant black man said to my supervisor, his name was Ross, he says, "Ross, when I die, my family will send word to you in Canada, and you will be invited to my funeral, and you will eat a piece of my heart." Apparently the ritual was that the person's heart is taken out, cut up into cubes, and the special people get to ingest the cube. So you, in that situation or in that ritual, become the next person, and life carries on. So dust to dust, ashes to ashes, fire to fire, flesh to flesh. It's a cycle of life. There was no you, basically forever. You're here for a blip of time, and then there will be no you again, basically forever. Reminds me, it's kind of depressing, yes? The gravestone that's said to be existing somewhere in Denmark. There's just a gravestone in the ground, nothing on it. There's no name, no date. There's just an inscription that says, "The one who did not exist." The one who did not exist. Wow, that's philosophical. It's also said that there were some young people, I think some alcohol apparently was involved there, but they were driven by curiosity because they'd heard the legend of this gravestone. So they decided to dig it up to see what was there. And they dug down quite a way, and they found that the grave was empty. No casket, no skeleton, no bones, nothing. Nothing. That's the point, isn't it? Nothingness. So it was a joke, it turns out. Someone playing a prank on life and death themes. It all comes to nothing. But it's a joke about a serious topic, and maybe that's what humor is all about. And maybe what's meaningful in life is to have a sense of humor about it, because if you take it too seriously, that's when the depression and the dark, frowny faces begin. So don't take it too seriously. Just laugh it off when you need to. Or that other pressure release that we all spend a significant amount of time, art. We escape into a movie, we escape into good books. Music hath charms to soothe the savage breast. So maybe it is artists that save us from the humdrum, right, the cicada existence, the shopping mall, and so forth, boring existence that most people exist in. And another fantasy that we sometimes have, the ideal dinner party. Suppose you could, from all of history, invite 10 people to a dinner party. You'd have them with you for the evening. Whom would you invite? It's interesting to think about why we like this exercise. Now, some people, of course, would go for people who got stuff done, even if they had to run roughshod over others, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Napoleon, so on, Winston Churchill. We need heroes. We want heroes. So the point of the dinner party game is to let those who've gone before, who've lived what we think were significant lives, be an inspiration to the rest of us. And almost all of us on our list put artists and musicians, because who can inspire us more than artists and musicians? So, Leonardo da Vinci, it's on my list, Michelangelo, Beethoven, Mozart. Mozart, of course, kind of a party animal. He'd be a good one for a couple of hours. Or if all of that's too highbrow for you, maybe Wilson Pickett, Katharine Hepburn, Elvis Presley. It's a fun exercise. So, art. And the artists inspire us. And we all think that we have our inner artist, our inner musician. Maybe we have that book in us. And the example of these people serves to energize us to get that out, to be more than we otherwise might be. But isn't it true, if we go down this road and encourage everyone to become artists and musicians, that for every genius like Michelangelo or Shakespeare, there are 1,000 mediocrities? They're never going to be Shakespeare. And for every 100 people who think maybe I've got what it takes, 99 are going to fail. They're going to crash, they're going to burn, they're going to have to live for the rest of their lives with the fact that they were failures at their great ambition. Now, a few highbrows and a few kids with great potential, right, they might make it, but aren't we doing people a disservice to idolize the great artists and the writers of the past? And what's the point of all these old dead guys as well? We say, maybe through art you can achieve immortality. My works will live on and be admired by subsequent generations. But isn't that a pipe dream? I mean, we have a few highbrow people who actually enjoy Shakespeare. We make every generation of school kids, we kind of torture them by making them read stuff from the great William Shakespeare. So who's getting anything out of Shakespeare anymore? It certainly is not even doing Shakespeare any good. The fact that we admire or pretend to admire him centuries later, it's not doing him any good because he's not here to receive our admiration and our praise. So what's the point of being Shakespeare in the first place? Of course, the answer then is to say, no, that is entirely to miss the point. Shakespeare matters because he carried on the social conversation, the long conversation. He contributed to it. He became part of it. And he showed us that if you try, he was a little kid from Stratford, you can achieve something with your life. And maybe the point is, yes, many of us will fail, or we won't achieve our great ambition on the Michelangelo scale. But part of life is not shrinking from the fact of failure. Embrace the failure, learn from the failure, pick yourself up, and go as far as you can. And that's what the greats and the semi-greats who went before us do for us, especially for the young people who have their whole lives ahead of them. But then, maybe we're overthinking it. All this speculation and encouragement about being the artist of your life, it's kind of pointless. We're not going to reinvent the wheel. We're all just one person. There already are, for the vast majority of us, rules and purposes in place. We're born into systems. There are moral rules that have been worked out. We're not brought into the world as the first man or the first woman anymore. We're born at a time and in a place. There are established ways of doing things. We all learn this from day one, before even we are able to realize that we are learning. We're born subject to authority, subject to power. Our parents, our teachers, our communities, the weight of all of that authority on young, unformed people is decisive. We grow up speaking a certain language. We didn't choose that. It shapes our thinking. It shapes our worldview. We grow up dressing a certain way, our food preferences, and our core values. So this idea that somehow your life is like an artistic blank slate and you can write on it whatever you want, by the time we get old enough to even start thinking in those terms, we are shaped. We are set. So, the way to find an authentic life is to immerse yourself into your authentic self, which has been created by the community and the traditions that you are a part of. You're not an individual lone wolf, an entrepreneur, an artist. Even the idea that somehow seriously you can question your own culture's traditions and reject it and become part of another culture, that is a pipe dream. Right? Of course, you can try to learn another language, but you will always have an accent. You think realistically you could learn to dream in Japanese and feel Swahili poetry the way Swahili speakers feel it? It's not possible to feel another culture deeply. We can have superficial engagements and appreciations of it. So your only chance for a full authenticity is to immerse yourself in your own culture, the culture of your birth and your training. Sound its depths, become its vehicle. But that's crap. And the fact is that on the important things, that we're not talking about food preferences, whether you wear a tie or not, or a skirt or not, your taste in fabric. On the deep things, on the important things, any human can, in fact, think through the traditions of their culture, think through every lesson that comes from their parents, and those of us who are active-minded from early on, we do this. And we can and should have a culture that encourages young people to do this. That's how cultures change, sometimes dramatically. It is possible for us to think through and dramatically come to new understandings. We are not only vehicles through which our culture exact. And this choosing having made an informed choice for yourself, that is the essence of the human condition. A thought experiment. This comes from social psychology. It says you observe the habits. I always think of Canadians and people who live in the northern part of the United States, where I do. And what happens is they tend to disappear as the cold weather sets in, and we don't see them again until spring. And what often happens in the coldest parts is they go into their homes, which become a kind of cave. And it's very comfortable. And they look forward to it in many cases. I can lay in supplies, I've got my internet, I've got my television, I've got lots of firewood for the fireplace. I don't need to go out. And in many cases, they don't leave the house for a week or weeks rather, on end. And they enjoy it. But here's the thought experiment. Suppose you went to any one of those people, and they've got everything laid in and they're ready, and you told them, you cannot leave your house for the next 2 weeks. And I get some big, strong guys, and I'm going to put them at all of around the doors on your house. So if you try to leave your house, these big guys will stop you from leaving your house. And the person is then inside their house for a week or for 2 weeks. How does that feel? It becomes intolerable. They can't stand it. The whole time they're in there, they are thinking about wanting to go out and do something and to get out of the house. And the point is that it has to be a choice. That's the human fundamental. We make choices, and to the extent that we make choices, we feel human authenticity. And maybe that's the problem with the long list of things that we've been considering so far. We've been trying to legislate for other people. Science will tell you, religion will tell you, society will tell you. Life is about choice. And to the extent that individuals make their own choices, they live meaningful lives. But then, if it's all about choice, why do so many people make such weak and unambitious choices? Go back to cat pictures on the internet and the vast majority of people at the mall. You think about most people, they are very conformist. They do just settle for whatever most people in society. They worry very much about what their neighbors think about them and their mothers-in-law and others. It's pathetic. They let their lives slip away. So maybe we should say, it's cruel. Most people don't live a meaningful life. Sad. But there are a few who do take their capacities and exercise them, and they are ambitious, and they do what it takes to make their vision come to life. And sometimes they run roughshod over the rest of them. And now, of course, we're arguing for elitism. And that runs against the grain for many people. We're not supposed to think some people are better than others and live better lives than others. And if other people have abdicated on achieving the best that's possible for human beings, they can be used by the few. The ancient aspiration about heaven, the predator and the prey, the lion will lie down with the lamb, everyone will be equal, a happily ever after story. Can we really just let that go? All right, well, let's talk about heaven then. Suppose we think it's going to be heaven afterwards. Maybe things are predator and prey, strong taking advantage of the weak here, and lots of people just giving up and letting life slip away from them. So we pin our hopes on an afterlife. Well, what is this afterlife going to be like? What is heaven all about? And we've got this very cartoonish understanding of heaven. We think we're going to die, it will be judgment day, there's heaven and hell, we have to get in line, and there's been a strong record kept of everything that we've done in our lives. And an authoritative person, perhaps St. Peter, will look at the list, do the goods outweigh the bads in some criteria, and you're one of the lucky ones. Okay, you get into heaven. And then you get your wings and your robes. You get a harp, and you're assigned to a cloud, right? And it's all lovely. We're all up there in our clean white robes playing our harp music. For how long do you want to listen to harp music? And the point is that we haven't thought it through, right? It's just some vague idea that in the afterlife everything's going to be great and wonderful. And maybe it's not harps and clouds that's your vision of heaven. Maybe you're on another path, and your goal is to get into heaven having died for the cause, and 72 virgins are waiting for you, and you can do whatever you want with those 72 virgins. So there you are. You're in heaven. 72 lovelies. What's with the obsession with virgins anyway? I mean, think about it. Maybe you want 36 virgins and 36 who actually know what they're doing and have some exotic experience. But setting aside the virgin thing, what are you going to do with them? Your body is decomposing in the desert, or if you got blown up in jihad, you don't have the equipment to do yourself or the virgins much good. So again, it's not thought through. It's just an abstraction, a placeholder. And we haven't answered the question, what's going to make life meaningful? But of course, this talk about disembodied souls and spirits going off into an afterworld, yes, that's not true. The fact is that now we are embodied beings. And part of the problem for religious mindsets, we might say, is that we long for life, but our bodies betray us eventually. And that explains the longing for an afterlife and some sort of heaven. Our bodies fail us, we die. And so we have this constant theme that religions come back to, that only if we have an immortal soul, right, is life going to make sense and have some meaning. We love life, but our bodies die, so the only way that we can be immortal is by having some sort of non-physical soul or spirit that's going to survive bodily death. Otherwise, it's just a gloomy story. But is that the only way? And then we think of the promise of biotech and the new immortality. If we love life and our bodies fail, well, we're starting to learn very rapidly that we can replace body parts as they wear out. Need a new heart? Got it. Corneas, kidneys, blood vessels, inner eardrums, re-engineered skin. We go through the list, and we're adding more and more to the list. So immortality in a new form, and maybe our brains, all of the complicated hardware, wetware, and software going on where all of our memories are stored and the information is processed, can be downloaded. Artificial intelligence becomes real intelligence, and we are re-uploaded with our newly engineered bodies. And so if we really are longing for immortality, maybe science looks like a better route than religion does to achieve the immortality. But then we're just come back to the beginning. Right? We have all of this life, potentially immortal. What are we going to do with it? What's going to make it meaningful? Now, why are we here? Well, we're here tonight because I think everything I ran through right now is the kind of discussions that university students should be having on a regular basis and on dozens and dozens of more issues. But it's increasingly hard to talk about those issues because we know now we live in changing cultural times. The universities have been, in some sense, revolutionized, particularly in some key departments, and the ethos has changed. Michel Foucault is probably the most influential intellectual of the last century, half century, I'll say. I won't make such a grand claim, definitely the last half century. And he is seen as the grandfather of postmodernism, whatever postmodernism is meant to be. And here he's offering a geological metaphor that is absolutely right about the shift that has occurred in the ethos. The deepest strata of Western culture have been exposed and are once more stirring under our feet. Western culture goes back to the Judeo-Christian tradition, Homer and the Greeks. We're talking thousands of years. The claim is all of that is being subject now inside the academy to an earthquake. We're getting down to bedrock. We are blasting the bedrock, and the fireworks and the volcanic eruptions are happening. Now that's to push hard on this metaphor, but that is what he is talking about. The stakes are high. We have a different environment. Second generation. This is now what students learn. When they go to university, almost all American universities have what they call orientation week. This is what you can expect for your years in university. And instead of getting an invitation to the great conversations about the meaning of life and all of the questions, and to meet the faculty who will introduce them to the kinds of issues that they're going to be exploring and the conflicts and so on, they get this. Some things cannot be said. We expect that you are a person likely to engage in inappropriate behavior and speech, and much of the first week of orientation is a kind of initial reconditioning. So it's a different kind of set of expectations. So you will be disciplined for, and then we get a very long list of things. If you say anything that's inappropriate about race, sex, religion, color, creed, disability, sexual orientation, national origin, ancestry, or age, you're in trouble. And what is the standard 18-year-old freshman reaction going to be to being confronted with this list? I better shut up. I'm just not going to talk about these subjects. And this is from the year 2000. This is just up the road from where I am in Illinois. This list is now much longer because they've had 20 more years to add to it. Two professors at Yale University, now 2 years ago. Some journalism. I'm only going to use Canadian and American examples. I won't speak to any Australian examples. You can fill in those yourselves, but they are happening here as well, as you know. Beloved professors, they lived in a faculty-student common dormitory. The idea is to encourage students and faculty to mix with each other on a regular basis. So it's not just, faculties come and go and so on. Love students, years of teaching. They had a big controversy one year about Halloween costume. The North American, I'm not sure if you guys celebrate it in the same way here, of dressing up in outlandish and sometimes offensive costumes because it's kind of a devil's night combined, and it's revelry, and if you're a little bit older, there's drinking that's involved. Of course, these are university students. If it's younger kids, it's all about getting lots of candy. And the word had come down from any number of student groups that they wanted to legislate what costumes other university students were going to be allowed to wear. And there was a long list of costumes. You cannot wear these costumes. These two professors tried to engage in reasonable conversation with them, say, why don't we live and let live? We've been doing this for hundreds of years. Let's not make a big deal about it. They were harassed, sworn at, shouted at, physically threatened by students in their face, and a year or two later decided they're going to get out of education. It's not where they want to spend their time. Laura Kipnis, a professor at Northwestern University in Chicago, was concerned about due process. She was very much a feminist and concerned about sexual harassment, particularly by the age-old story of professors hitting on female students, typically middle-aged professors. And one of her colleagues had been accused of sexual harassment. And it was very clear to Professor Kipnis that this was a serious allegation that the university had due process regulations that had been honed over generation in place. All of those were being flouted and set aside, and the professor in question was not going to get any sort of a hearing, including access to lawyers. And she, in faculty and in the news, stood up and said, hey, what about due process? She, in turn, was turned on by the activist student and other faculty groups at her own university and vilified for standing up for basic due process. Brett Weinstein, a professor, very popular professor of biology at a small liberal arts college in Oregon, had decided on a given day that he was going to conduct class as usual. On that day, there had been some ethnic students and some racial students groups who had been convinced in their minds that this college, although it's a very progressive, left-leaning college, was a hotbed of racism, and that white people, whether they realized it or not, were closet racists or outspoken racists, and that what they wanted to do on that day was have no white people on the campus at all. Only non-white people would be allowed to go to class, and all classes should be canceled so that various demonstrations and teach-ins about racial issues could be conducted. Professor Weinstein said, I'm going to conduct my class as usual. I don't think it's appropriate to single out any given race and to dictate to them that they can't come to campus. We are open to members of all races. We are here to educate, and I'm going to carry on business as usual. You can imagine the vitriol, and the whole campus essentially blew up for several weeks over this incident. Now, to my mind, we're going back in some ways to the early modern world. And it's worth contrasting the pre-modern world and the modern world with what we now call the postmodern world, because we still have a three-way debate. For a long time, we were having a two-way debate, but postmodernism is a new beast. And to understand the significance of the postmodern challenge, we need to go back to see the roots of the modern world. This is Giordano Bruno. He died in 1600. He was executed for heresy, and his heresy was being an early enthusiast for the heliocentric model of the solar system, the idea that the sun is at the center of the system and all of the planets rotate around it rather than the Earth being at the center of the solar system. Now, he was a bit of a wild man, but his Copernicus was the guy in the modern world who first suggested this, was the thing that got him into trouble. So he'd spent his time going all over Europe, basically staying out of Catholic Italy, where the Inquisition was rather active. This was, of course, if you put the dates to it, the century of Protestant Reformation and Counter-Reformation, and things were pretty ugly everywhere. That religious fervor was high, so he would stay away from the hotbeds. But he decided in 1592 that he would go back to Italy and try to engage in some discussion. He thought things had liberalized a little bit about the Copernican model. Nonetheless, he was arrested immediately upon his return, put into prison for 7 years, and then after 7 years, he was brought out, found guilty of heresy, the heresy of challenging orthodoxy in this case, and he was burned at the stake in 1600. So at this time, there was, again, a list of things that you can and can't talk about, positions that were orthodox positions, anyone who was advocating the inappropriate position if they run afoul of the authorities. We had banned books, one-sided reading lists, and so forth. Galileo, of course, is famous once he became a man of international stature, of finally standing up and saying, look, we should be able to argue about this issue, whether the sun is at the center, whether the earth is at the center. There are arguments and counter-arguments. There can be reasonable people on each side. What we should not do is burn people at the stake and use intimidation methods. The truth will out because we are all capable of reason and assessing the evidence. This is the new modern position against the position that says a top-down authority will dictate the one and only truths that are available to us. Galileo was persuasive on a vast number of intellectuals, publishing a piece in 1615, but in 1616, the church doubled down, saying, as a matter of official proclamation, no, this is not an issue that's going to be debated. The idea that the earth is spinning on its own axis while it's spinning around the sun, absolutely not. Some years later, Galileo was arrested, taken into the basement, shown the instruments of torture, and despite his stature, told that he would be subject to torture if he did not recant publicly his advocacy of the Copernican model and agree not ever again publicly to advocate it. He was then confined to house arrest for the rest of his life. He did do the public recantation. He did not want to call the church's bluff, and his books were subsequently banned. Now, all of this is going on in the early 1600s, late 1500s. We start to see among early modern intellectuals a reaction against the older, what we now call the pre-modern model, where there is one truth, there are authorized institutions that have access to that truth, What the rest of us are expected to do is listen to those authoritative institutions, read only the authoritative books, and believe on faith if we don't understand, and reasonably to the extent that we understand what the authoritative institutions are saying. What the moderns are starting to argue, like Galileo, is that we need to debate everything. Right? There should be no one-sided sacred truths locked down, and that good education requires that students especially be exposed to both sides of the debate, even the sides of the debate that any of one of us are convinced in our hearts and minds is absolutely wrong. We need to cover both sides. Now, Michel Montaigne is a Frenchman, but he's starting to work the same territory, another brilliant essayist. He's starting to argue this is what education is about. You might learn from the old texts and the authoritative teachings, but if you embrace those opinions by your own reasoning, then those opinions are not theirs, they become yours. You have to adopt them and internalize them yourself. Don't be a follower. You follow another, you follow nothing. And the reason for that is, and he gives a political metaphor, we shouldn't see ourselves on matters of truth as subject to a king, even if we do live in a kingdom. We are all our own kings, our own queens, deciding for ourselves what our truths are going to be. And the fact is, the way he puts it here, we all have the capacity for grasping the truth. We all have the capacity for reason. It's not only a small elite number of people who are specially endowed. So this is late 1500s also. Knowledge, Francis Bacon, this is now an Englishman, is a form of power. What we want to do, all of us, is use our reason to figure out the way the world works in order to make the world a better place. We're not simply interested in speculating and passing on. We want to know what actually works, and the only way that we're going to find out what actually works is by putting things to the test. And so here we have Galileo again arguing that actually, if you are religious, you should believe that religion is not a matter of mystical revelation and faith, but rather that God gave us brains, God made us, he gave us a mind, he wants us to use it. He wants everyone to use it. So he's trying to reconcile the early debates between Christianity and science by saying that ultimately they should converge. Right? God wants us, of course, to read his book, but he also wants us to study his greatest handiwork, the natural world, and figure out the way it works, and that's what science is all about. So stop torturing us. John Milton in England, this is now an international movement arguing for an abandonment of the common practice of censorship that all European sovereigns had been practiced. Right? Truth be in the field, let her and falsehood grapple, right? No censorship whatsoever, complete freedom of the press, open publication. We now have a widespread communications network across Europe. Let the best minds and all of the interested minds grapple with truth and figure things out. John Locke, another Englishman, especially, and this is where the big battles, of course, were being fought over religious matters. We have to recognize every person has their own mind, and the only way we're going to make progress individually and socially is by freeing individuals to pursue the truth as they see fit. In his case, he says, is arguing about religion. Religion does nobody any good if it's just a matter of following traditions more or less mindlessly that you happen to have been born into, or if you believe stuff because you're afraid to voice other opinions or ask certain sorts of questions. Religion only works if you work it out for yourself. And if you genuinely care for other people, you have to respect their right to work it out for themselves. You can't just give them a prepackaged set of religious answers and they accept it. It doesn't save their soul. So we have to be individualistic, and that means we have to be tolerant of all of the weird things that people are going to try in the name of pursuing religion. And not just religion, science, politics, everything, generalized position. So the modern world is coming into being. Great care, as Locke goes on to argue in his education writings, has to be taken when we're educating young people, never to make education like a business to kids, right, and to young people. It should be fun, it should be free. We love liberty and so on, and education should be a matter of play and recreation. Kids love to learn. They love to develop their minds. They love to develop their bodies. This is what we should encourage rather than a more traditional authoritative model that says, you will do this because I told you to do so. You will believe this because I told you to believe this. Cultivate that modern sense of liberty and exploration. Now, I mentioned myth of Gyges a little bit earlier. What we are contrasting here in the old point of the transition, rather, from the modern world out of the pre-modern world is an argument that had been developed by Galileo and John Locke and others against the traditional views that said human beings cannot be trusted with freedom. And so here the myth of Gyges, which I mentioned was the invisible ring. So you got a young guy who's a shepherd boy, he's out in the hills, and he's poor, doesn't have much of a love life, and he finds this ring in the cave on the skeleton of a dead person. He takes the ring off, puts it on, he's playing around, and he finds out that when he turns the stone facing inward, he becomes invisible. And so what does he do? Well, he's got power, the power of invisibility. And as the story goes from Plato and Herodotus, he basically just goes on a crime spree. He can do whatever he wants. And what do people want? Well, they want stuff. So Gyges goes out and he steals a bunch of stuff. He wants women. So he goes out and he rapes women. Of course, they don't know who's raping them, but there are people who had irritated them. He just kills those people as an act of revenge. And he steals and rapes and kills his way all the way to the top, kills the king, takes the king's wife, and assumes power over the kingdom. So the point here is, in this ancient myth, is that we don't really want people to have a lot of power. We don't want people to have a lot of freedom, because if people have a lot of freedom and a lot of power, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to do what Gyges did. And the question then is going to be, you can do this as your own thought experiment, of course. Don't do true confessions now, but if you had the ring of invisibility and you could do whatever you wanted, what would you do? Now, maybe you're one of the nicer people, but then you imagine your neighbors and others in society. So the more power and the more freedom that people have, and those two in combination with us, that sounds like a pretty toxic brew. So maybe what we need is not to try to liberate people and empower people. And I think when we're talking in modern liberal education about freedom and empowerment, this older view is saying that's absolutely what we don't want to do. Right? We need discipline. We need fear. Why was Gyges, before he had the ring, a pretty good guy, not engaging in crime? Well, because he was afraid that he would get caught. And what enabled him, would make him get caught, was that other people can monitor him. Right? There you are in your car, and there's no cops, and you're out on the highway. You speed, and as soon as you think you see what might be a cop ahead, right, that's when you start to obey the law. So we obey the law when the eyes of the police are on us, or if we are religious, when we think the eyes of God are on us, because if we don't have the eyes of the police and the eyes of God on us, we will do bad stuff. That's what the myth of Gyges teaches us. So kids need discipline, and it needs to be imposed upon us. So this is Plato's Allegory of the Cave, another famous one, where it's a little bit weird. Right? We imagine these guys, Plato says, imagine these guys from birth. He says they're us. This is the human condition. In this underground cave, and we've been chained at birth to only be able to face the back of the wall. Then there's this obstacle here. Behind it, there are these shadowy guys with animal cutouts and various other things. This is kind of a bird. This is like a vase. I don't know what that is. And what those do is, because there's this fire here, there's a projection. There are these various shadows on the wall. And so all their lives, these guys have seen these moving shadows and so forth, and they think that's the real world. And then at some point, Plato says, education begins. Because what happens is someone comes down and breaks their chain, makes the person stand up, and makes them, once they're standing up, turn toward the light. Of course, if your eyes are only acclimated to shadows your whole life, looking toward the light is going to hurt. It's going to be painful. But they make you look toward the light, and you learn something. You learn that what you thought were real objects, those are really just shadows on a wall, and that you're in some sort of an underground cave, and these things are more real, and there's a source of light and heat here. And the person says, your education is not yet over. And they take you by the wrist, and they drag you up this steep ascent, and your muscles aren't used to it. And as you get closer and closer to the cave mouth, the light from outside is getting brighter and brighter, and it's hurting your eyes, and you're tired, and you don't want to do it. But the person says, no, I need to take you up out to the higher world, to the real world. And then finally, you get out into the real world, and you see real birds and real trees and real animals, and you see the sun itself, the source of all light, the source of all heat, the source of life itself. Now you are an educated person. And now as an educated person, you see the real world the way it is. You have an obligation to go back down into the cave and rescue more people who are trapped in the cave. Now, this is the most influential model of education and reality in all of Western civilization. And of course, the person who goes down and rescues, that's the teacher. That's the parent who has the obligation to take children from the underground world to the higher world. But notice what's built into it. Right? Here we are all stuck in bondage in the lower world, and we're kind of fine with it. We don't really mind. Right? And modern Platonists will say, think of our teenagers down in the basement with the video game on, their bags of chips and other whatevers. They don't want to come out of the cave. What do you have to do as a good parent or as a good teacher? Go down there and get them out and say, go outside into the real world. So by nature, the argument is, human beings are pretty complacent. They don't mind being stuck in a cave. And it takes a strong, authoritative person to make them stand up, to liberate them to some extent, and to drag them up. The whole process is painful. Education is a painful process, but you have to go through it in order to achieve a certain kind of enlightenment. And your teachers and your parents are authorized, because they have your best interests at heart, at making you do what they know to be good for you, even if you don't necessarily think it's good for you. The ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy, part of the education here, is to say the poets are all about emotions, the philosophers are all about truth and reason, and a good part of education then is going to be that we have to monitor the kind of arts and poetry that students are exposed to. The wrong kinds of music, the wrong kinds of theatrical performances are dangerous, and human beings are naturally attracted to stuff that's not very good for their souls. So the wise person is going to be platonically philosophical, or taking them in the right direction. Should education be fun and childhood be fun? Well, we have a big, long quotation here. This is a little bit of death by PowerPoint, right? But the point is going to be that we can't let children play too much. We shouldn't. Education and growing to adulthood is a serious business, because if you just leave children to play, what do they start to do? They start to make up their own rules. And they think that it's about having fun. Right? But that's not the lesson that we want to teach. It's not about making up your own rules. If you're going to have games, there should be games in which there's one set of rules that have been decided, and children need to learn to follow the rules whether they want to or not. So the point is, putting all of this together, if we want to understand the way human beings should properly be raised, it's not at all liberal modern education. Right? We have to learn to follow the rules. Discipline has to be imposed. Children should learn to be obedient of parents and teachers. They need to be shielded from inappropriate music, art, books, ideas, only exposed to the truth. And whether you want to be educated or not, it should be a duty, and you should expect it to be rather painful. Now the point then, and this is more death by PowerPoint, is to put all of that in contrast to what modern education has striven for and this ideal of liberal education that came in the modern world to dominate, particularly universities, that earlier education would prepare students to be able to engage in this higher education, is that by the time especially they get to university, these things will be second nature. People will be independently thinking for themselves. It was going to be an education of the whole person, their mind and their body. It's going to be an expectation that human beings are born with the capacity to become whatever they want. They're not saddled, right, one way or the other with negativity. That children are naturally curious, and we can build on that natural curiosity, and particularly by the time we go to higher education, we want students to be exploring this great body, this universe of knowledge that the university is supposed to capture on their own. It should be pleasurable. It should be finding your passion, finding your calling. And of course, we want to give students lots of choices. We expect them to be adults and to have learned self-discipline. And we're going to de-emphasize punishment. We're going to emphasize the positive. We're going to have lots of open publishing, lots of open debate. Students can put any idea. We expect them to be exposed to all ideas in and out of the classrooms. And that theory, whatever they learn, is going to prepare them so that when they go out into the real world, they can put together a practical, successful life. Now, the point of all of this, then, is to say there's a big set of philosophical arguments that have led to the development of a very traditional, authoritarian, classical form of education. You can still find it extant in many parts of the world, including some parts of the Western world, but this is the modern ideal that came to be developed about 400 years ago, and it has swept the world in the last 400 years until the 20th century. So when the postmoderns come along, they are saying, yes, we're aware of the pre-modern tradition, philosophically, and the educational model that it has in mind. We are aware of the modern world and the educational model that it has in mind. And that there's been this ongoing clash between the more authoritarian types and the more libertarian types, between the more conservative types and the more innovation-focused types and so forth. What we are doing is rejecting all of that and advocating a new third option. We need to go post-modern. Now, what does that mean? So we go back to the Foucault slide. This is Richard Rorty, another famous postmodernist, the most famous of the American postmodernists. What are we trying to do as postmodernists? Well, we're trying to figure out what we're going to do now that both the age of faith, you think of the age of faith as the pre-modern world, essentially a religious and often authoritarian version of religion is in place, and that is culturally and educationally dominant. That seems to be beyond recovery, Rorty is arguing. But also this modern philosophy and the model of education that it generated, we also think that is beyond recovery. This is now John Gray, another international movement. We move from a Frenchman to an American, now to a Brit. We live today, right? Today being this generation, amid the dim ruins of the Enlightenment project, which was the ruling product of the modern period. So we've tried modernity, and it has been a disaster, leading to the dim ruins. Here's Jean-Francois Lyotard, another French postmodernist. He's actually the one who gave us the label postmodern, labeling our era the postmodern condition. Postmodernism, is based on the perception that there was a modern era that dates from the Enlightenment and has now run its course. We're at the end of the modern world. It's over. This modern era was predicated on progress. We thought that we were making progress in all sorts of cultural dimensions, but all of us can see that the development continues without leading to any of those dreams of emancipation. We're supposed to make progress. We're supposed to free. Liberal education was all about freeing and empowering human beings. It's all been a failure. It has all been a fraud. That's the theme of 4 of the leading postmodern thinkers. Now, they're all arguing against the Enlightenment. And if you've taken your Western Civ course, some of these names will be familiar to you. But Modern world goes back in philosophical designation to the formative figures like René Descartes, I think, therefore I am, John Locke, Francis Bacon, and others. And what they are known for, and what makes modern philosophy modern, is their insistence on reason being the fundamental human capacity. If we want to know, we have to exercise reason. This was modern because it was arguing we're not going to rely on authoritative traditions, religious traditions, or authoritative texts that have been handed down to us. Everything needs to be subject to reason, not faith, not mystical insight, and so on. The dates are significant here. You'll notice that these guys are all in the 1600s. When that battle won, and there was huge argument, then we start to see the beginnings of science being developed. 1660, Newton and Leibniz are doing their work in calculus. 1680, Newton develops Principia Mathematica. Modern physics is established. Modern astronomy is also being established at this point. A generation later or two, we get the Industrial Revolution. As all of this science, the groundwork is being laid, the inventiveness and the experimentation applies to engineering. The Industrial Revolution takes off another 2 generations later. If we take the early new science and we apply it to the human being, that's very complicated. We get rid of the old pre-modern witchcraft and hand-me-downs. We see the foundations of modern medicine being laid. If we take reason and we take that as fundamental and we say, well, reason operates in the individual, what that's going to mean then is we think reason is competent. Individuals should take charge of their own lives, and we're going to leave people free to run their own lives. So that's why we start to see all of the liberal revolutions that first happened in England, a little bit later in America, a little bit later in France, and so on. If you're going to have a democratic or republican political system, those all require great confidence in the thinking power of the vast majority of the citizens, because those are do-it-yourself enterprises. Most people can think about the important things, and we can have arguments and vote on things, and most of the time we're going to get things right. And just like the sciences, it's going to be a self-correcting process. All of that depends on reason. Capitalism, the idea that we're going to leave individuals free to run their economic lives as they see fit, produce whatever you want, trade with whomever you want, consume whatever you want, devolving to individualism. Now this then was the promise of the Enlightenment in the 1700s. This is the theory that we should have a world that is now based on reason and science and individualism and technology and so forth. And the claim was going to be that if we do that, we're going to become not only freer, but we'll become wealthier, we'll have more stuff, we will make progress in all important social dimensions. There is no problem in principle that smart, free human beings cannot solve. We've got the magic key to unlock all of the problems. Extraordinarily optimistic century. Now that is what the postmoderns say is a fraud, was false, has now run its course, has led to the dim ruins of society all around us. And they are philosophical about it. They are skeptical about the power of reason. Here's a powerful quote from a Foucauldian scholar arguing that it is meaningless to speak in the name of or against reason, truth, and knowledge. Let's see how powerful that is. It's not just that there are false theories of reason. Some people think they have the truth, but they're wrong. And sometimes what we think is knowledge isn't in fact knowledge. It's just these are meaningless concepts. By the time we get to the postmoderns, in the late 20th century, they are extraordinarily skeptical. There's a story why this happened, but I'm just saying that it is skeptical. This is what they're going after. They don't believe in the reason. It is a fraud. Richard Rorty on the philosophical concept of what we call anti-realism. For centuries, we've all been debating about what is the nature of reality, what's really real, are the gods real, and so forth, or not. Well, nobody knows the truth. There is no such thing as a true answer to those questions. Nobody's ever going to know. But notice what he's doing here. He's saying there's got a difficulty here. I agree with Foucault. There are truth, knowledge, meaningless concepts. Let's set those aside and so forth. So what we should do then is start thinking of ourselves as more like poets and less like physicists. That's an interesting switch, because physicists want to say there's a real world out there, and we should use our minds and experiments to figure out the way it works. But if we don't think that it's possible for us to figure out the way the world works truly and get knowledge about it, well, then what are we going to do as philosophers? Well, then we need to turn subjectively. So this is the big distinction now being introduced between objectivity and subjectivity. And the subjectivity that is going to sweep the higher education world is being announced in exactly this quote here. Because what do poets do? Well, poets don't really concern themselves with the outer world. They have their own thoughts and their own feelings, and what they're trying to do is externalize what's inside them. So philosophers are more like poets. We're making stuff up. We're legislating. We're not letting the world speak to us. That's a postmodern world highfalutin language. This is kind of interesting, right? Some will then say. This is a literary critic, postmodernist Stanley Fish, saying deconstruction is another technical term for a kind of postmodern literary analysis. There is no such thing as a right interpretation of texts. It relieves me of the obligation of being right. I don't have to worry about what's right and wrong. Instead, I just have to be interesting. But what's interesting? Well, that's a very subjective criterion. What's interesting to you, what's interesting to me, and so forth. So, interestingness is more important than rightness. Now, of course, if we're not interested in truth, we're just interested in being interested. If we're all trying to be poets, of course, that's one way that we can go. But many postmodernists are also interested in politics. They're interested in economics. They're interested in that sector of the economy. Franklin Tricky is an example here. Makes first the postmodern move. Well, we are seeking not to find the foundation and the conditions of truth. Okay, so we're not interested in truth. We're skeptical, we're relativistic, there is no such thing. Well, what are we interested in? Power. Power for the purpose of social change. My job as a university professor is not to pursue truth, not to pursue knowledge, not to help my students in their pursuit of truth and knowledge. That's gone. Is to use my power to make change happen socially. And I'm a professor, I have power over my students. We know the power of the professor. My task as a professor is to help students, quote, spot, confront, and work against the political horrors of one's time. Again, the assumption that the society we live in is a politically horrible place. That's my value agenda. I am subjectively committed to it. Whether it's true or not, we're not arguing about truth. It's what I feel, what I believe, and I use my power to advance that agenda. Postmodernism applied to women's issues, very prominent. I won't read the quotation. The Enlightenment had said we're all rational. We should liberate all of humanity, including women. And so the modern world has been about extending liberties equally to women on all dimensions of life. The idea being that women and men can progress together. We all come together for mutually beneficial relations. The argument, again, part of the dim ruins, the fraud of the Enlightenment has been that men don't really believe that. And they tell us a pretty story about liberating women, but this is what's really going on. It's invasion, it's ownership, it's predation. The flowers and the chocolates are a cover story. The same thing holds. The modern world has said maybe we should stop invading other countries and taking their stuff. Let's be capitalists instead. We'll make a bunch of stuff. We'll encourage democracy and republicanism around the world. Everybody will peacefully trade with each other. And so we will go to battle against brutal dictatorships when we have to, but we really believe in peace, liberty, the advancement of commerce, toleration, equality, and so forth. Another postmodernism arguing on foreign policy grounds, that too is a fraud. Saddam Hussein, the previous dictator of Iraq, was not a victim, or not not a bad guy, he was a victim, right, of Western departments of state. By Western departments of state, of course, we mean the Americans first and foremost, but also the British and their helpful allies, the Canadians and the Australians. Same thing is true of Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco. They too were products of cultures that had been victimized by essentially Western imperialists. Right? So really this dictatorship, just like all the other dictators, is a transfer of aporias, Greek word for problems. The capitalist system says it's liberal, free market, and so on, but it really is dysfunctional. It generates all kinds of internal problems, and then it sends them overseas, just like it produces all kinds of garbage and sends that overseas. So it looks fine, but really it's just causing problems in the rest of the world, and the rest of the world's problems are then not to be blamed on them. Now, where is this coming from in terms of political theory? Jacques Derrida, another huge name in the postmodern lexicon. Deconstruction, kind of a skeptical, relativized form of literary analysis, saying it never had any meaning or interest, at least in my eyes, and as a radicalization, that is to say, also within the tradition of a certain Marxism in the spirit of Marxism. And Marxism, as we know, is a strongly antagonistic class warfare, alienation, exploitation. We need a bloody revolution to overthrow current society, kill off all of our class memberships, and then during the period of a dictatorship of the proletariat, totally reshape the mindset of the surviving citizens and usher in a socialist utopia. So what we have then is at least one leading postmodernist saying, I'm carrying on the Marxist tradition, but we need to do it a different way. There are going to be some reasons for that. Now, I'm going to skip over some of these, this one anyway. In my story, the counter-revolution to the Enlightenment starts with Kant. That's controversial. But I wanted to point out that Kant is probably the most important philosopher of the last 200 years. His dates are doing his major publishing in the 1780s at the height of the Enlightenment, and one of his arguments is that even though he's in favor of some aspects of the Enlightenment, that its confidence in the power of reason is overstated, and that limits need to be put on the power of reason. So in the second preface to his most famous work, he says he's trying to put explicitly limits on knowledge through reason in order to open up some doors for faith. So he mounts a powerful skeptical attack on reason, and most philosophers and historians of philosophers will say that much of Western philosophy for the last 2 centuries has been working out the implications of Kant. That's a high whopping abstraction, but there is a lot of truth of it. He argues that what we have to do is abandon the idea that reason can come to understand reality as it really is, that instead what we consider our reality is a more subjective imposition on some raw materials that come in. And he has a series of arguments that he develops on all kinds of important philosophical issues. It says, look, if you use reason, you can argue this side of the thing very well. You can also argue this side, the contradictory side, very well. And so that just shows that reason really can't solve the problem. It just gets itself ensnared in contradictions if you push hard. Now that's to wave my hands at some very deep issues that would require a whole course to explore thoroughly, but the point is, this is a Copernican shift from objectivity to subjectivity. And I just want to march through the next 2 centuries in 40-year chunks. And these are all the big names in philosophy. Kant is huge. But if you jump 40 years, you get Kierkegaard, perhaps the most philosophical theologian of the last 2 centuries. But notice what the attitude have here is if you want to be properly religious, Kierkegaard ends up arguing, you have to, quote, crucify reason. So a leading thinker is now explicitly opposed to reason. So we're moving on from the Enlightenment. You have to leap into things and believe things that you know to be absurd. That's 1840s. By the time we get to 1880s, another 40 years, here's Nietzsche, another giant on the intellectual landscape, so influential on 20th century philosophy. And notice what he says about the human intellect. It's pitiful. It's shadowy, it's fleeting, it's aimless, it's capricious. That's the human intellect. And instead of relying on the intellect and relying on reason, what we should do is rely on our wills, right, that have been evolved and winnowed out, and assert our wills in the world. By the time we get another 40 years later, Martin Heidegger, the brightest star in German philosophy in the 1920s, and German philosophy was the most powerful, influential philosophy in the entire world. Heidegger is the top guy in the German philosophical world. And here at some point he's talking about a philosophical issue that has led philosophers into various knots of thinking. It leads to all these contradictions, and he says then, well, if this contradiction breaks the sovereignty of reason, that is to say, we don't think reason is sovereign anymore, then the fate of the rule of logic is also decided. We break reason, logic also has to go out the window. Logic disintegrates in the vortex of a more original questioning. So if we really want to get to the heart of things, we can't get there by reason, we can't get there by logic. And the point of all of this then is we're now into the 1920s, we're into the 20th century. This is then the decade when all of the leading postmodernists are born, the 1920s. Foucault, Rorty, Lyotard, and the others, they are going to grow up in this philosophical climate. They will become PhDs in the 1950s, significant players in their professions in the 1960s and 70s, grand old men in the 90s, and then they will die in the 2000s. But they, by the time they get to the end of their careers, are household names in this tradition, and they have trained hundreds and thousands of professors who then go out and teach our children. Now, the important point here is that none of these guys, this is to talk about epistemological issues, and this is not an accident, none of these guys is a liberal, a Democrat, a Republican, anything that we would recognize as any sort of modern Enlightenment political philosopher. They are all in keeping with the kind of epistemology that they're developing, anti-liberal and strongly authoritarian in various sorts. Nietzsche, right, for example, was hostile to socialism, but he was also hostile to capitalism. He saw himself as hopingly generating a new kind of aristocracy, a kind of individuals who would rise up the way Napoleon did, that Julius Caesar did, and Alexander the Great. And it's not only military examples, but people who will have an iron will, the will to power, and that's one of his great phrases, to rise up and just assert their will on the world and take the world where they want it to go. Heidegger was a Nazi, not just a National Socialist, not just a garden variety guy who signed up, but a screaming, gung-ho, powerful advocate of Nazism. Even after the horrors of National Socialism were exposed in World War II, he never recanted. He lived up until the 1970s, never apologized for his actions and words on behalf of National Socialism in the 1930s and the 1940s. Now, that's then to say, right, in terms of reason, reason is being rejected, and rejected strongly. Same thing holds for metaphysics and ethics, other important. Well, all value and normative theory, all of these statements are basically meaningless. This is Rudolf Carnap, another giant name. This is an Australian important ethical philosopher in the 1950s, Brian Medlin, summarizing where the philosophy profession was in the middle part of the century. Reason is out, logic is out, metaphysics is meaningless, statements in the value theory are meaningless, and ethical principles are, according to Medlin, published in a leading philosophy journal, arbitrary. What's good, what's bad, just make it up. It's all arbitrary. So, the idea that religion can give us absolute truths, totally rejected. The idea that by reason and science we can figure out workable truths about the way the world, absolutely rejected. Everything is rejected. This is an extraordinarily skeptical, relativistic, and ultimately nihilistic philosophical position that we are reaching into. I gave you some dates here. Here's Lyotard, Foucault, and so forth. They're all philosophy PhDs by the time we get into the 1950s. This is what they absorb. They are brilliant. They're getting first-rate philosophical educations from very good universities. They go on into their professions, and because of the power of their minds, the power of their arguments, all of them skeptical, relativistic, cynical, arbitrariness, and so forth, they convince a large number of their intellectual peers. So that's my first thesis. You get from Kant, you get to postmodernism. Now the problem, as I see it, is going to be a political problem. There's one more piece of the puzzle before we can go to questions. That's politics. There's a very weird thing that happens if you think about skepticism and relativism. Suppose you are a subjectivist and you think, okay, there is no truth, it's all arbitrary, just believe whatever you want. What should your political positions be? I mean, suppose all of us in this room, however many of us, we say, we all in our heart of hearts just come to believe it's all arbitrary, I can believe whatever I want, to be crudely. How many different political positions should we have represented in this room? Right? We're all just going to leap into whatever we want. We have enormous diversity. Now, the weird thing is, instead of this great diversity of political positions, what we find among the postmoderns is that they are all left. And not just left, far left. And not just far left, far, far left. The top 10, top 100, I've done the count, top 200 in the first two generations, all very far left in their politics. And that's weird. So how do we get a very small segment of the political spectrum adopting this highly relativized, skeptical position? And the politics then, I think, is going to be, in part, that all of them, as young men, committed to far-left politics in their youth. And one of the things that we do know about most young people's political commitments, particularly when they adopt strong, principled, moralistic understandings of the way the political process should work, they never change their minds. They might get more and more sophisticated in the strategies and doubling downs and reworkings of the theory, but they don't change their minds, and I think that happened. So Foucault joined the French Communist Party in the 1950s. He left, but in the 1960s he came around when Mao in communist China was a big deal. He said he was a Maoist, right? And in 1979 he expressed great support for the Islamic theocracy of all things. There's not a liberal bone in this man's body. Right, over the course of 3 decades, all sorts of authoritarianism appeals to him. Derrida is sympathetic to the French Communist Party. Lyotard was a member of the radical left. He was a Trotskyite. Trotsky was one of the original 3, Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky. He went with Trotskyism. Richard Rorty on the American spectrum, as far left as you can possibly go, far left social democrat. And that pattern, right, continues on and on. So what we then have is a uniform politics of some sort of Marxism needing to be reworked, combined with a very skeptical, relativized, subjectivist strategy. So Marx is looming here, but what we need to do is, I'm going to skip over some of this because I want to get to the political and educational implications more quickly, is a reworking of the theory. Because what we found, if we are committed to left politics, is that we can't, according to classical Marxism, just wait for the workers to rise up and mount the revolution and everything is going to happen. What the Marxists and the neo-Marxists and now the cultural Marxists and the advocates of the new left, and there starts to be a lot of different variations of left politics emerging at this point, is to say the old Marxist model isn't going to work, so what we need to do is be more proactive. We need to go through the institutions and work them from the inside. We're not going to do a revolution. One of the important sectors that was identified, and makes perfectly good sense since most of these people are graduate students and then professors, is we need to transform the education sector. That's going to mean not old-fashioned classical education. It's also going to mean not modern liberal education. We don't believe in those preconditions anymore. So everything is political. There's another quasi-postmodern thinker, Frederick Jameson. We need to politicize education, but in keeping with our postmodern philosophical sensibilities. Now, I want to just make a couple of quick connections here. You'll see the contemporary application very quickly. So here's Richard Rorty saying, look, if you're reasonable and you think that everybody is reasonable and everybody's individuals, then ultimately you think that we're all going to come to the same truths and that everybody should have the same rights and so forth. And so the liberal cosmopolitanism of the modern world starts to make a whole lot of sense. But if you start to think that reason is kind of weak and that it's conditioned, that we're all pushed around by our emotions and our circumstances and everything is very subjective and relativistic, then the fact is going to be, when you look out at the world, that people are raised in very different circumstances and they're not ever going to come to agreement. They're going to be shaped in very different directions, and there's no way rationally that we can expect people to reach any sort of universal truth. So one thing that we find in the postmodernism literature is a very fast retreat from any sort of universalism to group balkanization. And here's Rorty saying, we must, in practice, privilege our own group. We're all raised in a certain group, it gets into our bones, and we just have to advocate. But I have to recognize there are other groups, and they're just going to believe in, feel very different things, and so we're in what he calls the ethnocentric predicament of colliding ethnic views, and there is no way to get out of that. Now, once leading philosophers start to say that and convince their peers, what's going to happen when we turn to education? Well, here's Henry Giraud, one of the leading philosophers of education from the postmodern perspective, some high language, but within the discourse of modernity, right, the modern word, the other is defined within blah, blah, blah. So the basic idea here is that everybody is supposed to have the same universal principles applied to them, all of us. But what that really means from our postmodern perspective is, since the whites and the Europeans are in the upper hand, when they say everybody should believe the same thing, what they really mean is everybody should think like us. That is to say, they want to have the rational, white, male, Eurocentric subject that occupies the positions of power. So really, universal theories and universal right is code for white people saying everybody has to adopt the white way of thinking ethnically. Now, he's obviously opposed to that, so what then is going to be the implication is we need to start attacking the white way of thinking, arguing that there are other ethnicities, other races, that they all have their own way of thinking, and that the university is going to be more of a colliding battleground of these different ways of thinking. Here's Franklin Trickius, postmodern, arguing, well, if we're not about truth, if we're not about knowledge, if we are about exercising power for the purpose of social change, that gets applied. There's Chandra Mohanty arguing, how should we understand the classroom? Well, classrooms are now political and cultural sites. Classrooms are about politics. Classrooms are about cultural transformation. That represent accommodations and contestations, right, over knowledge. It's a struggle over different knowledges, and every group has its own knowledge, its own truths, and so forth. And the problem is that, of course, some of those groups are differently empowered. Some have more power, some have less power, and that's not appropriate, that's not fair. And so what we need to do then as teachers and students is get into the different groups, race, gender, and so forth, and allow the contestating to happen. That's what the postmodern classroom is going to look like. Teachers, even teachers, right? Particularly in modern liberal Western civilization, right? They believe in empowering their students, that Western civilization has made great strides and so forth. What we need to do, and the important word here is going to be problematic. What we first need to do is train teachers in schools of education to realize that their own voices, their own histories, and their own ideologies are problematic. We will spend a lot of time teaching aspiring teachers about their own cultural traditions, and of course what we mean by that is the majority, white, modern, universal, Protestant, whatever civilization, that is a very problematic system, that they've been imbued with it, they've adopted it, they've been acculturated to it, and they need to get outside of their own skins and start to feel guilty and skeptical about their own tradition. So, otherness, that is to say, all of the other views, or all the other groups that are out there in society, that the teachers need to realize that those groups, deeply politically and pedagogically need to be the focus, not your own groups. It's not your job as a teacher to assimilate or to say there are universal values or there are right truths, even in mathematics and science. Instead, different others have their own views and so forth. There's an example at the University of Minnesota. I'm only going to use American examples at this point. This College of Education, the Race Culture Class and Gender Task Group, which had enormous power within this very large school of intergender. Teacher candidates, in order to get their certification and graduate, must demonstrate that they reject the American dream. Now, the American dream means some different things to different people, but the idea that we all have universal rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that we're going to be tolerant, separate church and state, right? That anybody, if they work hard enough, can achieve their dream. You have to demonstrate that you think that is a fraud. Otherwise, you will not get your certificate. Aspiring teachers must be able to explain how institutional racism works, right? White, middle-class Christian history of white racism. You have to be an expert on all of that stuff. So the assumption has to be all of this stuff about putting the sins of the past behind us, that we genuinely believe in equal rights and so forth in the modern world. That is a fraud, that the United States is fundamentally a racist society. This quotation again from the classic Andrea Dworkin, taken up by postmodern feminists. There's lots of versions of feminism, as you know, out there, but this one, of course, leads to certain implication. Here's from Penny Strange. When we are writing and rewriting the science textbooks and so forth, what we need to do is, quote, escape from the patriarchal science, right, in which the conquest of nature is a projection of sexual dominance, right? So science with its universal theories, right, that we're going to penetrate the secrets of nature, right? We're going to use our knowledge to big factories and big missiles to blow stuff up. All of that is just patriarchal, and an appropriate reworking of the science literature will not be operating on those assumptions. So theory, practice, over the course of the last 2 generations. Now one more big chart for you. The moderns think objectivity is possible, right? Science is great, reason is universal, we believe in all of these good things here, and what you find is the postmoderns, as a matter of philosophical principle, reject all of them and replace them with their opposites, and to the extent that they have been culturally powerful in universities, and there has been a huge shift. They transform the curriculum, they transform the faculty, they transform the missions of universities, hate speech, restrictions, reworkings of mission statements, decisions about hiring and so forth, all of that follows. So all of the journalistic stuff that we're exposed to for the last 10 years or so is that applied. Now, the postmoderns are bad on the Enlightenment. I've been making the case for them. Here's Lyotard again. I just want to pull out this quote again to say that, look, what he thinks he is in favor of is poverty, despotism, and ignorance. And why he thinks the Enlightenment has been a failure is because he thinks it didn't deliver on any of those goods. So what I want to do is look at some very quick statistics on poverty, despotism, and ignorance over the last 2 centuries. Poverty. This is the world in 1812. Right? Every circle is a country. They're color-coded by region of the world, big population, small population, and so on. This is income per person, GDP. It's also adjusted for purchasing power, $400 a year, 1,000. It's logarithmic, so 2,000, 4,000, 10,000, 20, 40, 100,000. So richer countries further over here, poorer countries down here. This vertical axis is life expectancy at birth, 25, 30, 35, 40 years, right, and so on. This is 1812. So that then is to say, if we just go, say, right in the middle here, which seems to be about the center of gravity, average income around the world is about $750 per person, and life expectancy is in the low 30s. All right, so that's data that we're somewhat familiar with. These countries here are some Western European nations. That's England, right, the very first nation of the Enlightenment, Newton, Locke, Bacon, and so forth, where the Enlightenment first grappled hold. England is starting to pull away. This is the United States, right? here. This is Holland. So what we then have is some countries there. So some European countries where the Enlightenment has started to take hold, things are improving. But notice, if you are a member of the richest country in the world, that's less than $3,000 per person per year. This is 2012 American dollars, and your life expectancy is barely over 40. So this is first generation after the Enlightenment. Now I want to jump 100 years. This is now 1912. So we go from this to that. And what has happened then is almost all European nations, particularly the Western European nations that all were down here, are all up there. Huge gains in life expectancy and in wealth. And because this is a logarithmic scale, it's a little bit deceptive. So this is around $2,000 here. Now we are close to $10,000. And then life expectancy and so on. That's the United States, right? That's Canada. We always have to point out Canada, since that's where I'm from. And then the rest are European nations, and there are 2 East Asian nations. So that's 1912. Now I want to jump one more century, 2012. This is our generation. So that's 8 years ago, right? The best data. And that's amazing. 200 years. And to put things in somewhat perspective, look at them all together. If we go back here, 200 years ago, every country in the world was down here. There's nobody there anymore. We've taken the whole world out of poverty. We've taken the whole world and doubled or more life expectancies. Now, if the left, the postmodern left, is genuinely interested in the alleviation of poverty, they should be the happiest people in the world. But they're not, because it wasn't the left that delivered us out of poverty. It was their hated enemy, the liberal capitalists. So there's something else going on. So that's, by comparison, that looks like progress to me. That looks like facts. That looks like industrial revolution, liberal democracy, medicine, and so forth, delivering on the goods. Now, we're also interested in various forms of despotism, right? Despotism according to race and slavery and second-class status of women, right, for much of history and many cultures. These are some American data. 1920s, different kinds of degrees. So this is the number of medical degrees granted to women in 1920 or in 1950. Right, it's gone up by 1995, and that number is still ascending. And the same thing for doctoral degrees, law degrees, right, and so forth. Entirely an upward trend. So if you are a postmodern feminist and you want to make the argument that women are slaves of various sorts and the patriarchy is brutal, right, this is, of course, one data point that is difficult. It looks like progress to me against any sort of sexism. This is slavery. It's shocking to think 250 years ago, over 80% of the world's population were slaves or serfs, close cousin, and so forth, and steady decline. This is the Enlightenment belief in the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness universally for all people, no matter what. Genuine belief in democratic republican institutions, the abolishing of slavery. Of course, we agonize at how long that has taken, the residual amounts of racism that are still with us, but that's looks like progress to me. This is a chart from 2013. They do this every 5 years or so, so I should update this, but this is a worldwide survey asking people about their attitudes toward racial tolerance and various other kinds of tolerance and so on. So the question here is, are you comfortable with living around and working with people of other races, yes or no, in your neighborhood and so on? And how many people said, I don't want to live near people who are a different color than I am? So if you are blue, that means between 0 and 5% of that population said, yeah, I just don't want to live with people of other races. And then the closer you get to red, you find people saying, right, more and more, I don't want to live with other races. So the blue are the most tolerant racially, the most integrated, the red, the least. And then if you look, it's almost uniform. 40% these nations here, right, these nations here, these nations here, and of course there's Australia. So what we do, of course, find is that almost all of the postmodernism is most manifest in the United States, Canada, UK. I won't speak to Australia. You can do your own judgment call there. But by all of the data, those are the least racist countries in the world, and they're actually the least racist societies in history. So postmoderns, again, should be happy, and they have some data points. So the progress, in my view, is real. But that's to talk about progress, that's to talk about reality, that's to talk about facts, that's to talk about data. If you're skeptical about any of those things, that's a philosophical antithesis toward accepting these kinds of claims in the first place. And if you have a political agenda, we know this, you have a political agenda, you are going to be resistant to facts all the way down. So what we have is a very entrenched professoriate that is committed to an agenda and resistant. So we have today's cultural wars. Now, I've talked a lot about education models tonight. I have a journal piece in this article where I lay this out much more systematically. I invite you, of course, to read more of my stuff. I've written some books that bear directly upon this, explaining postmodernism. This is my analysis of the philosophical and political left and the disaster that that has resulted in. This is my analysis of the philosophical and political right, and the disasters that have come out of that. So I covered the whole battleground. This is available in an Australian edition. And then if you don't want the disaster that is either far right or far left, some sort of modernized liberalism for the 21st century, I have a brand new book out, actually just published this month here in Australia, Liberalism, Pro and Con, for more as well. Now, I want to, I think, pause and take questions, but I do have a couple of closing remarks that if the boss lets me, I will make, because our theme is the meaning of life, and sometimes the dying can say some things about that. So I'm going to turn things over to questions, and Sam McClellan, the MC, will help me out here, I understand.
Can we please have a round of applause for Professor Stephen Hicks?
Thank you.
Yep, I think you've deserved a glass of water there. So I think we're just going to jump straight into questions. Would you like to briefly describe what's happening on Saturday?
Well, yes, this was a fly over the territory at 40,000 feet. And a lot of issues about human nature, about rights, about values, about knowledge. What we're going to be doing on Saturday is a deep dive into all of those issues, the arguments the postmoderns make, counter arguments against them, and we will essentially be having 4 deep postmodern versus modern philosophy seminars over the course of the day.
Wonderful. So we do have a book signing at the end of the conclusion, just out in the foyer, but have we got some questions from the audience? And I've got a lovely assistant over there.
Well, thank you first for the excellent lecture, and thank you for coming to Australia. It's just great to have you here.
Yeah, appreciate that. Thank you.
I'm a student at Melbourne University, which is very close to here in philosophy and psychology. And as an aspiring intellectual, I want to know, what can I do? I mean, it seems that the normal path isn't exactly all it turns out to be with, they're teaching postmodernism and all that kind of stuff. And I can completely corroborate what you said. They have a course, a subject called reason, and they teach us the orthodox view about reason, but it's not a very good defense that they give, and they just twist it around and teach us basically reason is mystical, like it's just crazy. So do you have any advice about where I can go, where we could go after university or during university, anything like that?
Yeah. Well, that's a hard question, because to the extent that the classroom is politicized in this bad sense, you have all the pathologies that come with it, right? Students are afraid to speak their own minds. They're afraid to explore their own views. They're afraid to try out ideas and argue for positions in essays and to get constructive feedback from their professors. So you, to the extent that you have a postmodern professor, you are going to get a second or third-rate education as a result. So you do have to make up that territory on your own time. Now, fortunately, we do have the internet, so you can find lots of good stuff, but you have to be entrepreneurial in order to get a first-rate education in many institutions now. Now, you also ask about grad school, and that's a hard one because depending on the department you choose, if you don't find a department where there are genuinely professors open to reason, genuinely open to liberal education, you'll be miserable, and or you will be self-sabotaging. You will intentionally censor yourself. That's not quite the right word, but you will suppress your own development just in order to get through. And then by the time you get through, you basically will have destroyed yourself, so you won't be any good as an intellect or as a professor anyway. So the only way to do this is, again, by research. And what you need to do, unfortunately, we do have a big world, there are lots of good universities, is find professors whose work you admire, who you think are good, and read their work. And then when you're applying to graduate schools, apply to those graduate schools. But I always say, write directly to the professors that you want to work with. They will be flattered, right, that an undergraduate has read their work and wants to come and study with them, and it will make a difference. They will speak to the admissions committee, maybe they are on the admissions committee, and so forth. So gone, unfortunately, are the days where you can just say, all right, this is a pretty good university, I'm going to go there. There will be lots of people I disagree with, but lots of people I can work with. Now you have to be much more due diligence before you make a commitment.
Thank you very much, Professor Hicks, for a wonderful lecture. I've done quite a lot of education in philosophy and theology, particularly at some of the universities here. Something that's always been mysterious to me is, so if there's no truth in postmodern thinking, but at the same time we're advocating for social change, doesn't social change itself demand a certain concept of right and wrong truth?
Yeah.
And it's this gaping hole of logic that is never questioned that I find absolutely difficult to handle. I've had arguments with academics about this, and just wondering whether you have anything to say on that.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right that that's a paradox, because most postmodernists in one breath will talk subjectivism, skepticism, relativism, and so on. But then as soon as they turn to value issues, they become very dogmatic and absolutist, and there's one conception of right and wrong, and they have it, and you better follow along. So how do you combine those two? Well, I think the first thing is to say there's no way to combine them logically. So you're right to be puzzled, and there's no squaring of the circle. So at this point, I think it becomes more a matter of personal psychology of the individual rather than a philosophical working out. So I think the way it can happen is one of two ways, that one side or the other really is primary in that person's thinking. It can be, okay, I've done some philosophy, I've read all these skeptical arguments about subjectivism and then there being no truth, and I'm convinced by those. So I really believe that there is no such thing as truth. So what do I then do? Well, it just so happens, though, that I am already a young adult and I've got a certain set of value commitments and political commitments. So what I might as well do is just double down on what happens to be my set of subjective beliefs and pour myself into advocacy of those. Now, I'm not going to, in any meta sense, step back and say, I think my beliefs are objectively true. If you push me, I'll say they're just my subjective beliefs, but everybody just has subjective beliefs, and it's either just do nothing or go for your subjective beliefs. So they will combine a belief in the skepticism with a subjective commitment to whatever it is. The other way to go at it, though, is to say that the skepticism really is disingenuous, right? That it's tactical. That what's really going on is you've got someone who believes in a political vision. They believe they're right. They believe absolutely that their politics is true, and they want to achieve it. But what they find, though, is that all of the tools that the postmoderns have developed are very useful in dealing with your opponents. Right? So you can deploy all of these skeptical arguments tactically against arguments by other people. So suppose I'll be a very strong socialist, for example, and you and I are having an argument, and you're advocating, and you're saying, well, what about the great track record of capitalism? And you trot all of this data, and you compare this country to that country, right, and so forth. And so you're doing a really good job on logic and data and so forth. But then if I can just say to you, yeah, but don't you understand that logic is just subjective and polylogism, and didn't you read that article by so-and-so on this, that, and the other thing? And what then do you immediately have to do? Well, you have to stop talking about the data and the arguments, and you have to start dredging your memory about polylogism, and now you have to defend the position that no, in fact, there's only one logic, and there are such things as facts. So you have to spend a lot of time doing epistemology, and in the meantime, we've just forgotten the fact that you had all of this really good data and cross-country comparisons and so forth. So I've diverted the argument away from the data into skeptical epistemology, and that just puts you on the back burner. Now, I might not believe that you really are a racist, right? But if I suppose that we're getting into some argument, right, or whatever, we all know this probably from firsthand. If I can just play the race card, right, I know that you're going to be put on the defensive. You're going to say, whoa, man, right? And it's going to shake you up. And then suddenly, again, you are on the defensive, and how are you going to prove that you're not a racist? And you have to do that meta-argument before you can come back to the initial issue. So I think in many cases, it's people, they really believe that they have the truth, and they will just play games about perspectival truth and so forth and use them as tactical weapons.
Sam. Blue shirt. Similar hairstyle to me.
Hello, thanks for the talk. The older I get, the seemingly less I know, but I'm kind of gravitating to like trying to understand tension, and like the more I kind of like try to see both sides of the story, the more I get involved or more interested in tension points. What's your what do you think about how tension can go forward?
That's an interesting way of formulating kind of the educational process and the learning process. Because it is fairly common for us to start with a limited body of experience and a certain set of beliefs. And we all, if we're open-minded people and we're alert and we're thoughtful people, we have some confidence. But then as we grow, it is natural for us to realize that the world is more complicated, and other people have had different experiences and have put different belief packages together. And so that it can be initially unsettling. So then you feel, oh, wait, well, maybe I don't know what I think I know as well as I do. And that's a healthy thing to do, because then you take that other person's experience into account as best you can. Any criticisms of your position, you take those into account. You might find that you have a response to those criticisms, but now you have, in fact, learned more. But you also might find that actually the criticism works and you have to change your mind, and then you come to adopt a new piece. So all of those are points of tension, and I think that's all part of the learning process. So embrace it.
Yes. How is it that a philosophy which is so counterintuitive to many of us, certainly to practical people, people outside the academy, so contradicted by the facts, as you've pointed out, has held such sway in universities, certainly in the English-speaking world? Many of the characters you mentioned, they were doing their work 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's a long time for these ideas to have arisen and to have been counted. But that these ideas seem to be spreading outside of universities and have a very dominant role in society.
Yeah.
Seems strange to me to how that can be so.
Yeah. Good. Well, I think the way you put it is to say outside of the university, practical people have to deal with facts. They have to deal with the real world. It's a cliche about ivory towers and when professors saying to their students, when you get out into the real world, implying that you're in an artificial world right now, there is a lot of truth to those cliches. So one reason is an institutional reason, and that is that The departments in which these ideas are most prominent are most insulated from the real world implications. There's no market feedback. And if you're a tenured professor, there's not going to be any danger of being fired if you are miseducating students and so forth. Within the university, I don't want to overstate how bad things are in the universities, because in many universities, large segments of them are beautiful and perfectly healthy and committed to objectivity and making good progress. So the engineering schools, the medical schools, even the law schools to a large extent, nursing programs and so forth, many business schools still very healthy and so on. And the reason for all of that is that if you are in engineering, law, business, and so forth, you're closer to the real world, and so you get the market feedback a lot more. And if you're not good at teaching students how to do good work in those fields, well, then you don't get the grants. And the students also will exert market feedback on you because they want to have the sense that they're actually learning stuff. But if you come to departments of history, departments of literature, departments of sociology, you can get away with a lot without the rubber ever meeting the road.
Okay, the last two questions, and then.
Hello, I was just wondering, I believe that human value has actually been has been tied too much with government and with politics. And people today think, like, for example, our government, at least in New South Wales and in Victoria, and I think in New York, abortion at 9 months is perfectly fine. And people are okay with it. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on human value and human life and the fact that it's so tied to government and politics and how people seem to be perfectly fine with killing their own babies.
Okay. Well, yes, I am, in philosophical labels, a liberal. And that then is to say, I think people should be free to run their own lives. And that involves a strong measure of responsibility over your lives. Now, my view underlying that is that people are smart, and if they learn to use their minds well, they can take full responsibility for their lives and make a go of it. And that also that reasonable people can work out their differences peacefully. Now, to the extent that you're skeptical about any of those things, then you're going to say people can't handle freedom, they can't handle responsibility, and to the extent that you don't think that people can handle freedom and responsibility, someone else is going to have to look after them. So I think the first part of what you're saying is absolutely right, that there has been a shift among intellectuals away from trusting most people to be free and responsible, and they have urged, as a matter of policy, that the decision-making responsibility to be shifted to other agencies, especially government agencies. So there's been a strong uptick in that. And then there's been a ratchet effect, because once government agencies get certain powers, they never want to give it back, and so they know the system from inside, and so they know how to ratchet up the amount of power, and so there's a drift in that direction. Now, the reasons for that are partly philosophical. Do you think people have the capacity of reason to govern their own lives, or do you think that most of them are stupid and ignorant and need to be looked after? Do you think people are basically decent and able to, in a rational way, work out their differences and find mutually agreeable solutions, or do you think that people are predator-type species at each other's throat, at strong versus weak, and so we need to have paternal powers keeping us from basically tearing each other's throats out? And the more pessimistic positions have been winning, and so we've had an increase in government power.
So we'll take the last question, but if you really wanted to say something to Professor Hicks, there's a chance after in the foyer.
Hello, my name is Kate Oski, and thank you very much for your talk. I found it amazing and inspirational. I was just wondering if you had any predictions about the future of postmodernism and where it could lead, when it will end, and what the next stage would be.
No, that's a great question. So crystal ball gazing always fraught with difficulty, but I am optimistic about this for a few reasons. One reason I'm optimistic is I think it's the nature of intellectuals. They're pretty smart, curious people. They like ideas, and postmodernism is getting old. Right? It has been around for a while. We're now into the third generation. It's institutionalized with tenured professors and so forth, and that's part of the problem. But there is a strong sense among intellectuals that we don't want to just retread the same arguments over and over again. Particularly younger people, they want to come in and not spend 30 or 40 years hashing and rehashing the same old arguments. I think there also are market pressures inside the universities. Now that postmodernism has gotten worse, students, young people, they want to do something with their lives, right? And so when they go into classes, if they're not already psychologically disturbed, they're off-put by the more radical manifestations of postmodern. I don't want 4 years of being told that I'm a racist, a genocidal, right, whatever. I want to learn something. And so the enrollment numbers are shifting out of the departments that are dominated by postmodernism into healthier departments, and administrators do start to take notice of that. Now, the United States, I know, is a different situation because the amount of the number rather of private universities and the amount of private philanthropy underscoring private universities and even the public universities is huge. It's by a large percentage the largest in the world. And donors are starting to notice. They read the news. They see stuff going on at their alma mater. And the kind of person who would write a $100,000 check or sometimes a $2 million check or say, I'm going to leave my net assets in my will to my university, they're rewriting their wills. They're not writing the $1 million checks to their alma maters. The college presidents and the boards of trustees, they notice, and then they start to put the pressure on and so on. And of course, there's just the general public as well, particularly in the publicly funded universities. You know, this taxpayer dollars. You people are supposed to be educating our children. You're engaging in professional irresponsibility, and so through the political process, there's pressure being put on universities as well. So I think we will win. I think it will be ugly. It will be brutal. But to some extent, the nastiness that comes out of postmodernism is a sign of a dying movement, because we know, dying animals can get very vicious. So I think some of the viciousness is coming from that. So let's stick it out and fight the good fight.
Well, I'm very glad that I've booked you in for some more sessions in Melbourne, because I think we need that, and I hope you're going to come along, Kate. So we'll move into the book signing in the foyer. So Stephen Hicks will be seated. You'll see a table of books there, so you're welcome to make your way out there. Thank you very much for coming out this evening.
Thank you. Thanks, man.